Yes, good morning. Let me get situated with my weekly fiddling with media. All right, just about set. Okay. Yes. Good morning, everybody. Morning, C3 people. Uh, Good morning, anyone else who's joining us. Morning, Instagrammers. So here I am again, another week um, in this very strange time to be alive. I have a talk entitled this morning "Crisis and Calling." But as I was kind of working through it, I thought maybe a better title is something like "Good News and Bad News." So maybe it's a combination: crisis, calling, good news, bad news, something like that. And I want to tell a folk tale this morning, an English folk tale, and I want to read a little bit from Pema Chodron, When Things Fall Apart, just a paragraph or two. I could just read the entire essay, When Things Fall Apart. Ah, she's so good. Um, yeah, and then I want to talk a little bit about Greek mythology, which is something I've talked about before, and some of these words like fate and destiny. And um, yeah, I hope you're doing well um, and are healthy or healthy enough. And yeah, I mean, we'll get started. So, to the C3 people, just wanted to to thank you for your support of C3, your ongoing support of C3. You make this thing happen, whatever this is, this live Facebook thing, helping support our musicians and being there for one another. Please, please, please read our newsletter. And if you want to be a part of C3, sign up for the newsletter. Go to our website, c3westmichigan.org. We're a small community in that ordinarily meets in Grand Haven, and you can join us any week. We always have like a live thing anyway, a Facebook Live. But when all this is over, whenever that is, we'd love to see you out in Grand Haven. And anyway, sign up for the newsletter. That has all the information. It also um, gives you a window into what else is going on in our community, and if you need help, or if you want to be of some assistance to someone who may need help in our community, that's the way to stay connected. Um, and this is, we're going to experiment this morning with something new. So I'm going to speak for 20 minutes or so. I'm going to hand it over to our musician Dave uh, right after this. So stay on the Facebook C3 page, and I'll repost his live music. And then at 11 o'clock a.m., I want to do a check in, a Zoom check in with the C3 people. That link is in the newsletter. So you can fiddle with Zoom at 11 o'clock, and we'll see what happens. We'll just try it. We'll every single week at C3 we have what's called talkback. So I give a talk or someone else gives a talk, and we sit around and we discuss what's coming up for us, what are we hearing, what's going on. That's what we want to do today. But maybe just even more of a check-in. It won't be long, but it'll be a chance to see one another's faces, um, and sort of be in that format. So that's at 11 o'clock. So 10 o'clock right now I'm going to talk, followed by the musician, and then come back on at 11 on the Zoom call, but you have to have signed up for our newsletter to get that link. Um, Okay, yes, folktale. We need a good folktale, a good English folktale. So here it is. Two friends were who hadn't seen each other in a long time were out for a walk, and they bumped into each other, and they were sort of excited to see one another. And one friend said to the other, "Hey, it's been a long time. How's it going?" He said, "Well, really not too great since last time I saw you." And the man says, "Well, why not? What's going on?" He's like, "Well, I got married." He's like, "Well, you got married? That's great news." And the man says, "Yeah, but I married a shrew." He's like, "Ooh, that is bad news. Sorry to hear that." And he said, "Well, actually, it's not that bad news. When I got married, I also acquired 2,000 pounds because of this marriage, meaning money." And the man says, "Oh, that is indeed great news." He said, "Well, it's not so great news because I took those 2,000 pounds and hid it in the wool of my sheep. And the sheep rotted and they died." And he said, "Oh, man, that is terrible news. I'm so sorry to hear that your sheep is dead." He said, "Well, actually, it's not that bad of news because then I sold the hides for more money than the sheep was worth." He says, "Wow, that's great news indeed." He says, "Well, not such great news. Then I took the money and hid it in the house." He's like, "Well, that's good news. You've got this money in your house." So he's like, "No, actually, it's not such good news because the house burned down to the ground." He says, "Wow, that is indeed awful news, terrible news." He's like, "Well, it's actually not that bad of news because my wife was in the house when it burned down." So, oh man, what a strange story. You have to love the English and the Irish for that matter. I'm Irish. This sounds actually more like an Irish story than an English story, in my opinion. A bit of that dark humor. So, what is this folk tale about, and why do we tell folk tales in the first place? We tell folk tales because we need um, we need stories to tell us to hint at what's true beneath the facts. Beneath the facts of life, there are these resonant, universal patterns of truth, and that's where a good folk tale comes in. A good myth, a good legend. It clues us into something. And this story, I think, is so amazing because if you just break it down and ask questions like, what's good news, what's bad news, and how does it work, it gets kind of complicated. Every single piece of this story can be spun in one way or the other. Is it good news that he got married? Bad news that he got married? Good news that he acquired money? Bad news that he acquired money? And it's like in the story, things keep falling apart and coming back together, and falling apart and coming back together. And and also, if we ask the question, why would you tell a story like this? Well, to tell the truth beneath the truth, that there's something more than just circumstances. And the question of circumstances is also the question of interpretation. Hence, good news, bad news. What is good news? What is bad news? And in a culture right now where we are absolutely inundated with facts and statistics and competing facts and things like that, and we wonder, of course, where's the truth? What is the truth? And we start asking, what is good news? What is bad news? We are getting closer to this folk tale. We're getting closer to the resonant chords or the bass notes beneath the music, so to speak, beneath the melody and the cymbal crashes and the loudness of things, the bass notes. And the bass notes are telling us something maybe a bit different. So here's a line from Pema Chodron, which I just love. She says this. Life is like that. It's almost as if she heard me telling this story about good news, bad news. Life is like that. We don't know anything. Life is like that. We don't know anything. We call something bad. We call it good. But really, we just don't know. It's like saying something like, time will tell. Time will tell. And um, the moment we're too sure that something is good, it opens up into something else. The moment we're too sure that something is bad, it opens up into something else. That's what I'm hearing in this story. So let me read a bit more from Pema here. Again, this book is called When Things Fall Apart. Highly recommend it. Here it is. If you have the money and the time to purchase a book, it'd probably be a good one. Let me take a quick pause and check in with my Facebook Live people. I just want to make sure everything is good to go. I've been having ongoing problems with going live each week, and is that good news, or is that bad news? Time will tell. Okay, so just hearing a bit of the cycles of things. Listen to what Pema says here. Things falling apart is a kind of testing and also a kind of healing. What an interesting way of putting things. It's a kind of testing and a kind of healing. We think that the point is to pass the test or overcome the problem. And here I think we're getting very close to a kind of very American and Western way of orienting ourselves to the world. Not a very Eastern, really sort of Buddhist way of orienting toward the world, which is where Pema is coming from here. But every problem is to be overcome. That's very Western, very privileged, very conquering oriented. So listen again. Things falling apart is a kind of testing and also a kind of healing. We think that the point is to pass the test or overcome the problem. But the truth is that things don't really get solved. We think, but part of us says, yes, they do. Whatever we're in, we need to overcome and solve the problem and fix the problem. But she's saying something more interesting here. Is that really the best way of looking at things? She says, they come together and they fall apart. They come together and they fall apart. They come together and they fall apart. This is like Buddhism 101. This is like everything is impermanent. But as soon as I say something like that, we think, well, except my life, except my worldview, except my politics, except my way of being in the world, except my nest egg, except my home and my lifestyle. And that's not impermanent. That is permanent, we say without saying it. She says, everything is like this. Things fall apart and they come back together. It's like the good news, bad story, the good news, bad news story from the folktale. Well, bad news is I got married. Good news is it came with money. Bad news is I hid the money on the sheep died. Oh, that's bad news. Actually, it's good news because I sold the hides for more money. Oh, well, that's good news. Yeah, but then I hid the money in the house. Oh, and the house burned down. Well, that's terrible news. Yeah, well, it's actually good news because my wife was in the house. This is that things fall apart and things come together. Things fall apart and things come together. And I think the question, what Pema Chodron is asking here is, how do we orient ourselves to the reality of things, to the impermanence of life, to the vapor that is, to the cotton seeds that are here one moment and next they're cast to the wind, that kind of thing. How do I orient ourselves to the world? So let's listen to more of what Pema says here. Things come together again and things fall apart. It's just like that. The healing comes from letting there be room for all of this to happen. Room for grief and room for relief. Room for misery and for joy. She's sort of like saying that you say yes. Even maybe in a sense to our interpretations of good and bad. I think on the one hand, she's saying we have to let go of these labels of good and bad. On the other hand, just the raw experience is what we're being invited to say yes to. Yes to the grief, yes to the joy, yes to the relief, yes to the misery. Just yes, just opening toward that. She goes on, when we think that something is going to bring us pleasure, we don't know what's really going to happen. Like that one sort of toy that you imagined yourself getting. I remember my brother once, he was like an early iPhone adopter. This is kind of a dark story, speaking of Irish and English humor here. Um, and he was an early adopter, and he had the brand new version of the brand new iPhone. And this was like, back in the day, it was like mind blown. The iPhone, the thing that holds your music, you can also make calls. It was like, this is unbelievable, and it's connected to the internet. So he had the very first one, and we were together as a family. And this was when my dad was still alive, but he had ALS, so his hands really weren't working very well. And my brother, I'm not making this up, it was sort of like, good news, I've got the new iPhone. And he hands the phone to my dad. My dad takes it in his hand. It slips through his hand and falls in a glass of full water. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And good news, bad news. No, things happen. Things come together and things fall apart. Good news, I got the new iPhone. Bad news is I dropped it in a glass of water. So, and the cycle turns over again and keeps turning over again, something like that. So let me read some more from her. When we think something is going to give us misery, we don't know. So we think something is going to give us pleasure, but we don't really know. We think something is going to bring us misery, but we don't really know. Letting there be room for not knowing is the most important thing of all. Letting there be room for not knowing is the most important thing of all. We try to do what we think is going to help, but we don't know. We never know if we're going to fall flat or sit up tall. When there's a big disappointment, we don't know if that's the end of the story. And I just want to allow those words to sink in for a moment, sort of in the grand scheme of things, the big story that's unfolding for us all right now. When there's a big disappointment, we don't know if that's the end of the story. It may just be the beginning of a great adventure. Life is like that. We don't know anything. We call something bad, we call it good, but really we just don't know. Oh, my brother is online, and he said, I still have that phone and it still works. Okay, see, good news, bad news, good news, bad news. Good news is, got a phone. Bad news is, my dad dropped it in the water. Good news is, it still works. And the cycle continues. That's actually quite unbelievable. Hi, Dan. Nice to see you in this online format. He's on Instagram. So, oh man. All right, so where do I want to go from here? Maybe I just want to remind us this morning that everything is impermanent. Everything is passing away. Everything has a terminal disease. Every moment is a vapor. And in every moment we pass through these ways of feeling the world, misery and joy and pleasure and difficulty and suffering and new life. And that is the way it is. And I think what Pema is saying is breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. And zoom out. Zoom in and zoom out. Both. Zoom in and zoom out. This present moment and some kind of larger perspective on the present moment, on the unfolding of things, on the cycles of things. So maybe what I'd like to emphasize this morning is just to remind us to make room for what is actually happening. Make room for what is actually happening. not just the stories of what we think is actually happening. I think that's what's so addictive right now. It's so addictive that we have a story for what's happening, and it confirms my bias amazingly. Amazingly, the things I'm reading on the internet and reposting and retweeting confirms my bias. Surprise, surprise. Of course it does. Of course it confirms your bias. Um, but I think let's make room for what is actually happening, not just the stories that we're trying to generate and prop up and fashion for what's happening. Calling things good and bad, like the folk tale is poking around it. Let me read one other line, and then I want to say something about the Greeks, and then I'll let you all go. When things fall apart and we're on the verge of we know not what, when things fall apart and we're on the verge of we know not what, the test for each of us is to stay on that brink and not concretize, meaning white knuckle it, not concretize. And by concretize, maybe we could say concretize our position, our worldview, our ego, our politics, our interpretation. Don't concretize, she's saying. Stay on the edge of your limits. Live with that kind of vulnerability and openness. The spiritual journey is not about heaven, she says, and finally getting to a place that's really swell or great or awesome. In fact, that way of looking at things is what keeps us miserable. Thinking that we can find some lasting pleasure and avoid pain is what Buddhism calls samsara, the hopeless cycle that goes round and round endlessly and causes us to suffer greatly. It's our addiction to the fantasy that everything, if we just obey the rules or follow the right God, everything is going to turn out in some sort of heaven-like stance. She's saying, let that thing go. That is samsara. That is the very thing that keeps us miserable. So one final piece here around crisis and calling. So the Greeks had a word for this cycle, this good news, bad news, turning over of things, and they called it fate. And maybe to the modern ear, particularly the Protestant informed modern ear, we hear words like fate and we think like God's cruel will or something like that. But I think the Greeks had in a way, a less rigid view of fate. Fate is simply the things you can't do anything about. Like, here we are, born into this family, into this skin color, into this area of the world at this time. None of us chose this. That's fate. Fate is the cycles of nature, of chaos and order and chaos and order and the turning over of things. It's the way things are. And the Greeks, with their musings about fate, were saying something like, you can't do anything about it. You can't do anything about the things that happen unto us. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're hopeless, that we are cogs in a machine, that we must become fatalistic. They actually say something quite different. They say that fate, the pressures of fate, of circumstance, we might say, causes us to look deeper in terms of destiny. How am I going to orient myself to the world? And the person of destiny in the Greek mindset was the person that turns with courage, fullness of heart, opening up like this toward the dramas of fate, like pulling toward the dramas of fate, come what may, being unable to do some things about the world and able to do some other things for the world. That was kind of a messed up sentence. Able to change some things and unable to change some things. Maybe that's the way of saying it. But opening up with courage, with fullness of heart like this, is to live into one's destiny in the midst of things we can't do anything about, whether it's misfortune or fortune. Because we know on one level that's just going to turn itself around again. So let me end with a little reading by a friend of mine at at Animas Valley Institute in Colorado, where I'm doing some ongoing guide training. So this is what she had to say not that long ago in an email. And I want to end. It's kind of a sort of a poem, prose, prayer sort of thing. So here are my closing words, and then hang out on the C3 page. I'll repost Dave, our musician, this morning. And then at 11 o'clock, those of you who are part of the C3 community can join me for a Zoom kind of roundtable. All right. I offer gratitude to the ways in which our current circumstances may awaken a wide and deep appreciation for our interconnectedness, how we are each affected by one another, and our habits and choices, a greater awareness of the sources to our nourishment and supplies, and the industries and systems we have not wholly considered. May there be a global invitation to return to a village consciousness. I offer prayers that our resilient bodies remain or become healthier, that we are kind and compassionate to one another, that we demonstrate our respect and understanding for our human circumstances in the context of our place on earth. May we listen each day for how we might be good partners for each other, human, wild, and otherwise, for how we might see what we may have been unable to see before, and to sing our songs, and shed our tears, and shout our exaltations, rejoice and fall to our knees for the heartbreak and beauty that is before us. Peace, my friends.